Hello and welcome to the All Things Social Impact podcast. I'm your host, Andrea Kanaris, and today I'm joined by Kieren Moffat. Kieren, would you like to introduce yourself and tell our viewers a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. Really fantastic to join you. My name is Kieren Moffat, as you said, and I'm a social and organizational psychologist by training. And currently, I'm the CEO and co-founder of Voconiq. We're a data and technology company, and we specialize in social performance data, so community sentiment data, and helping our customers to understand their social risks through understanding their communities more clearly. And I guess I came to this via a social psychology background, so real measurement, research measurement background, and a history in my research of looking at social conflict, and that has real application in often a mining context, but wherever there's an industrial interaction where there's a social context.
Thank you very much. I know we've kind of come across each other quite a bit over the years, but let's start with, I guess, just to frame it, when we talk social impact, because everyone seems to have a different definition, right? So just to help our viewers understand when you're talking about social impact, and I know you don't call yourself a social impact practitioner. I mean, I might argue with that. But when we talk social impact, what does that mean for you, just so we can frame it for the viewers?
Yeah, good one. I mean, I don't call myself a social impact practitioner, and I'm not really one for definition. So this is a kind of odd thing for an academic kind of background person to do. Often because I think definitions really get in the way or become a real distraction in the conversation about the real things we're trying to improve or understand. So yeah, I mean, I feel like that my work and the work that we do in Voconiq is about supporting impact practitioners and a range of other professional groups to understand that social context more effectively so that they can apply their professional skills to their particular role and task in a more effective way. So as an enabler of better practice, whatever that practice heritage sort of looks like. For me, impact assessment is, my take on it is, my work, two things are central: the experiences of people and their voice in speaking to those experiences.
Yeah.
So I think that these are kind of the human experience behind the facts and the figures, the share market prices, the revenue forecasts, the news of the day, that effectively the language of companies and industry. So in behind that, what's important is that we find ways to support those people as humans to speak into those issues in ways that allow companies, industries, institutions to understand them, and per our logo, to bridge those worlds, if you like. So in really tangible ways, I think what we do is important to support companies and communities to build stronger, more productive relationships based on that greater level of shared understanding. And so for companies, impact is about managing risk, and being true and compliant with their regulated license. And for communities, it's the same. It's also being able to influence the decisions made that affect them. So and often in this work or this consideration of impact, it's about trying to help people in both of those worlds to achieve their ambition, which is to do things differently and better. And I feel like if we can put those experiences into a form that a company or whoever can understand more clearly their experience, then we're taking some big steps towards a more sympathetic, more empathetic approach to their management, however it is that you define that process.
Yeah. No, I love that. And I think that's a really good point. We all love a definition, but I find in social impact, it is about connecting dots and the right dots. And sometimes definitions are a boundary for that. When it comes to the nitty gritty real life application of it, of trying to muck your way through the layers of complexity that sits between the relationships, but even the activities of a mining company or a large infrastructure, and how it plays out in the community, the definitions can get in the way. So I really love framing it that way. So you alluded to being a background in the psychology. So how did you start your social impact journey. I know you say you're not a practitioner, but the work that you do definitely translates to social impact in the communities, and particularly the communities you work with and the companies that you work with. So what was your journey like?
Yeah, well, I mean, I did start with definitions, and I recognise their utility. I mean, we start with that, but I think it can be a distraction to the work, or sometimes deliberately so. So, what's my background and story? I mean, I guess I was at university. I did my honors degree in psychology. I fell into a PhD program mostly because didn't cost me anything, and I managed to jag a scholarship, and felt like a kind of neat thing to do next. And then I had a really supportive supervisor who allowed me to kind of follow my interest rather than just kind of get through really quickly, and got into the organizational psychology kind of space, and did some coursework in that as well. So it allowed me to kind of look at big issues like how do we support or how do we understand the nature of conflict between groups like Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland? That was the stuff. Or how do we understand intergroup relationships post World War II? It was just super fascinating, interesting stuff. And I did my PhD research with the Australian Defence Force, so I did research in each of the three branches. And again, super interesting, if only to show how fish out of water I was in those contexts. And I come from a military family, and so I kind of understood it. But first day I turned up at a naval base in a suit, and the commanding officer there just said, "Don't wear that tomorrow. They won't talk to you." So actually, some really strong parallels to the impact world, right? Which is
Yes.
engagement. You need to fit in. You need to relate. So I learned some valuable lessons early there. But then the back end of that research program, I needed work. I needed to live. A scholarship had run out. I was sort
Yeah.
of, and I got a job with a consulting company who worked mostly in mining. And I was on a project at ULAN in New South Wales, and driving in and out of that coal mine every day was super interesting. The work inside the fence was not really engaging. It was sort of leadership training, and
Mm.
not really my bag. But the journey in and out was super interesting because I noticed that there were signs on the side of the road, handwritten signs written by community saying, "Get out of here, mining. It's terrible for the environment, and whatever. Stop mining." And then the next day, we drive past that same tree, and that sign will have been ripped down, and a new sign would have been put up, I think, by somebody who worked there, and saying, mining creates jobs, and so you could see that there was this conversation happening in almost real time, but in a quite destructive way.
Yeah.
And it started to get me thinking about how that work I was doing on intergroup relations might have some application in that domain. And it was sort of helping inform how I was kind of thinking about that. And I got the opportunity then to apply for a job at CSIRO and a National Science Agency, and got that. Again, had two fantastic female bosses there who really created space for me to find my feet, to find how that work, that understanding might have application in social sustainability and mining. So I read a lot and talked to a lot of people, and a lot of people were very, very polite and kind of were saying, come back when you've got something a bit more tangible, but here's some kind of help along the way, and that was very
Yeah.
much appreciated. And then eventually I kind of found my feet with this concept of social license to operate.
Yeah.
And talking about definitions, there was good definition around SLO. And I started doing some work there with some colleagues, Richard Parsons stands out, Justine Lacey, and some others, Erong Zhang, and we started that work thinking we're going to blow this up, because very clearly this is sort of CEOs using this term as a catch-all for anything social, assuming they have this thing, social license, and whatever else. And I went a bit deeper in it, and what we found, of course, was there is utility in what's underneath that label. And I talked to Jim Cooney, who kind of coined the term, and talked to him a few times and visited with him, and it was really instructive to go, actually, there's more to this thing, and we could see that in the data as well. And so that kind of got me some momentum, I guess, in a really focused direction.
Mm.
And from there, you can see the application of that research in lots of different spaces, including impact
Yeah.
practice. So that's really where I started. And from there, once we got some traction with an early paper, a 2014 paper that used some new statistical methods on new for this area, methods on survey data, suddenly the light bulbs are going off for people that were presenting that too. And these are people in resource companies, gas companies, mining companies,
Yeah.
and they were going, oh, now you're reflecting my experience in data and in a kind of visual way that I think my engineer colleagues who run everything else in the mining company are going to be able to relate to. And that just was a massive light bulb in thinking, okay, we have a genuine way to do applied research that has impact, which is Cyro's brief. And so really just then run that down. I presented that work all over the world, anywhere I could get money to go to. I presented
Mm.
it all around the country, and the purpose of that was to kind of socialize it and get a
Yeah.
sense for how it was landing, what parts of it were useful and what parts were confusing or needed work, and to get a steer on where next. I remember presenting that work in a tea room in Mackay with this sort of secret group of different company, impact professionals and community relations people who weren't really allowed to kind of get together, but they did every couple of weeks and have drink some terrible coffee, but having really wonderful conversation about this stuff on a laptop around a little tea room table and just thinking, yeah, this is, I could see the relief in their eyes that we were somehow reflecting their experiences in ways and things that they know are important, but in ways that really help guide their practice and guide their finite resources and time efficiently to focus on the things that matter most in that relationship with community. And so, that's just sort of very kind of short version, but
Yeah.
it
It's a long
was.
battle for yeah, it's a long battle. The social license, I think you're right. I always feel conflicted about social license because I kind of hate it because it's been hijacked a lot of the time. It's been used as a kind of, it almost lost its meaning somewhere in there. And yet I also know that underneath that, the concept of some of the things that it's meant to do, critically important.
Well, I think it's always useful to remember where it comes from, right? Which is that it was a metaphor used by a mining executive to help his colleagues to understand their responsibilities in Place of Dome at the time, bought by Rio Tinto, extended beyond their legal license to operate.
Yeah.
That's all it was. That's all it was. Throwaway kind
Yeah.
of thing to how it gripped, and it's imperfect. But when we started doing that work, we kind of expanded out what we were seeing in the literature at the time. Then empirically, so through data, demonstrated what's in the box is meaningful. And what's in the box, none of that has the label social license to operate.
Yeah.
We're talking
Exactly.
about impact perception. We're talking about benefit perception. We're talking about faith in governance arrangements. We're talking about procedural fairness or the extent to which a company listens to a community effectively and
Mm.
is willing to change based on the community's concerns. These are the things that then influence trust in the company and acceptance of its activities. So we don't use that terminology except where a company uses it themselves to start the conversation with them about how we can
Yes.
support them in improving their relationships. And that's why I kind of have a thing about definitions, just because I've seen how you're absolutely right. The terms get hijacked, they get used for a particular purpose. And it's not just companies doing that, communities do that as well, and
Yes.
different actors that are involved. And
Of
it's
course.
a contest. That is actually one of the key things that underpins that concept is it's a contest around what is acceptable at any point in time and a negotiation of those terms of acceptability over time. That's what we're really talking about. And in that, there are whole big concepts of rebalancing power in relationships and finding creative ways to influence development if there are no productive and constructive ways. There are big things in here that we're trying to grapple with. And our job as researchers and now taking that out into Voconiq to is to do that in a way that is accessible to everybody who's in the conversation and
Yeah.
support them through that knowledge to do things differently.
Yeah, that's so important. And the one thing that really stood out to me in you telling the story about Voconic and how it got there and how you got to, developing what is now Voconiq and the community voices kind of work that you do, is the bridging the gap kind of stuff that you alluded to at the very beginning of our discussion. Because how important was it to really, I mean, you alluded to some of it, you told some of it, but how important was it to bridge that gap between the social science speak, broadly, whether it be the psychologist or whether you be a sociologist or a social scientist, but we speak a different language. I quite often say we're the awkward, kid in the corner in some of these, engineering firms, mining companies, wherever we are, because they don't speak our language. Their whole business is very different. But bridging that gap is kind of what you did in a lot of the ways to be able to get these companies to come on board and go, it's like the light bulb, that seems like something you said and did turned on that light bulb in their heads, and they were able to actually understand what you were talking. So would you mind stepping through, so what were the things that you did, or that you, from your perspective, was able to do that? Because there's going to be people listening going, how did you get these companies on board?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so there's a lot. All right, so
More questions here, Kieren.
it was kind of accidental. So we kind of lucked into into a moment of, and then went, oh, okay, there's something in this, and then doubled down and doubled down. So what was the thing? The thing was these relationships between companies and communities, say, complex. They're multi-layered, they're dynamic, they're often different for each individual, but that's too much complexity for a company to be able to manage effectively, for anybody to manage effectively. So what we're doing is, first of all, we're using a methodology that reduces some of that complexity. You do lose some of that richness, but through using surveys, we're able to aggregate data, but then also split out and understand the views of different groups within a community around a particular set of issues, say. So that's the first thing. We're sort of reducing complexity by aggregating voices into groups. And then what we're doing is the lucky bit was this technique that we use, path analysis. So it's quite sophisticated statistical technique, very common in academic social research, but not common at all in practice, in applied context, mostly because it's complicated to do and quite, it's quite advanced. So you need specialized skills to do that. So it's expensive to do. But what it produces is effectively boxes and arrows going from left to right. So in each box are a collection of questions that were used in the surveys, and the responses that people had then are used to analyze the relationship between concepts, so between impact perception and trust. So the more severe you experience an impact in these particular areas, the lower your level of trust in a company, and then that lowers your level of acceptance with that company. So that's the typical sort of relationship there. And by having boxes with that stuff in it and arrows that connect them, and then a number on the arrow, that was a weighting effectively of that pathway in the broader model or recipe for social license. Then what we saw, and this is the lucky bit, is them going, oh, that looks just like some of the diagrams that our engineer colleagues use in their work.
Yeah.
And they're going to respect the math that sits behind it. They're going to respect the academic heritage of that work, that we didn't make it up. And I think overall then, it's an empirical version of a story that is very similar to the ones that impact practitioners were telling inside companies, but their language, as you say, was different to those of their colleagues. And you said, they don't understand our language. Well, we don't understand theirs too, quite often.
Exactly.
And so what we were then able to see was that there was a common thread here, that those, saying engineers, but everybody that's sort of technical or not social in a company could look at that and go, oh, I get it. And I can see that there's something behind this with rigor. And so what we heard from practitioners was, well, now I have a language that's equivalent. Now I have a language that sits alongside and isn't pushed down, the types of performance metrics and relationships that were being described around other parts of the business. And from there, we started to learn really fast about, okay, well, that's cool. And now we need to be able to tell the story of this quite complex. So then we had the same problem. We had to tell the story of quite a complex, difficult process to practitioners who are not trained in that space. and to give them compelling ways to convey those stories to others in the business. So sort of translate and then translate again.
Yeah.
And, I think what we've been doing is quite effectively harming those parts of the business that engage with communities with more than just sort of slides with pictures of community and quotes from community members. And that was often what we would hear from people, which is those slides sit alongside production figures, and it's just not taken seriously.
Yeah.
So if we can do that for them, then that at least gets them in the room. And so some of the great successes early were saying we're sort of walking into a crib room or a boardroom and seeing our data on the same performance wall of data as everything else in the business. And that was really, that was when, okay, we're onto something
You're
here.
on the track. Yeah. You know that you've hit onto something. So that's really interesting, because the one thing we always hear is, and it's a big debate, I think, even in the social sciences itself, but particularly when we start talking to outside like engineers and the like, is quantifying. And I think the social scientists or the social people, we tend to quite often go, why does everything have to be quantified? And it's like, I think maybe there's a misinterpretation of or we've got a narrow view of what quantifying is just counting. But I think it is, listening to your conversation, it's more than, it doesn't have to be quantifying necessarily counting things. It's also about actually quantifying what the relationships between what the community said and what's actually happening and occurring. Is that correct? Would that be a better understanding of what quantifying the data actually means when you're talking, say, to an engineer or someone who's going, or a CEO who's going, what does this actually mean? Quantify it for me.
Yeah. There's a few parts there too, which are really interesting. One is that using a sporting metaphor, I apologize in advance,
No, that's right. I like my sport.
you need to help them, audience, whoever that audience is, that technical audience, you need to help them to stop playing the man and to play the ball. So that just means
Yeah.
stop having a crack at the methodology and pay attention to what the evidence
Yes.
is telling us. To
100%.
get there, you can't just say that. To get there, you have to build credibility in the process. And so in a measurement context, we didn't make much of this stuff up. We're leaning into and refining, as per the scientific method,
Yeah.
what generations of researchers have done in this. So a concept like trust. I remember going to an International Council on Mining and Metals committee meeting years ago, and somebody saying, why are we even measuring trust? Trust is irrelevant in this context. The literature tells us something different, that trust is important, at least, and that it's worth measuring. And the next question is, can you measure it? Well, yeah, there is a long history of measuring trust in its various dimensions. And that research shows us that there are valid ways to do this. There are demonstrated ways to do this. And we just stand on their shoulders and adapt it for the context in which we operate. So immediately we can have that conversation, and they relate to that because they come from the same kind of tradition, which is that you can't just make something up. There needs to be, and we're not the first to do much of anything. So actually adapting to context is what mining companies do all the time, and they're adapting specialized knowledge, and it's about demonstrating credibility in a specialized body of knowledge. So once you've established that credibility, then building out from there, the measurement approach, you're right, it's not just about counting things. And I think that's a real trap that
Yes.
companies are really recognizing as a trap, which is, counting number of interactions as a measure of performance is common and is important, but it doesn't tell you how those interactions are relating to your risk. I think that's where that methodology around using more sophisticated techniques, you have to understand how that technique works, but just trust that it's real, trust that we're not making that up. It shows you the relationship between things that you're observing in the world and their consequences for the business. And
Yeah.
that can really help to orient people's attention. And you say, we can reduce our risk in something that we all have experience in when it's realized. Everyone working in a mining company or a resource company has experienced one of those projects that went absolutely sideways and is an albatross on the
Yes.
books, right? Like everybody's got that experience. Well, we could understand that before it happens. We could prevent those things by understanding ahead of time where the problems are arising in ways, because I think often practitioners know where those problems are arising, but in ways that allow us to communicate that with urgency inside a business that
Yes.
that really has a bias towards quantitative understanding of itself and
Yeah.
its effect on the world.
Yeah.
So, so then measurement becomes a tool to support a conversation. It's, I say to everybody that we work with, is what we do is not a silver bullet. Our measurement framework is not a silver bullet. It won't fix the problem, but it will help you to ask much better, more precise questions.
Yes.
And that goes for inside the company as it does for outside when
Yeah.
you're engaging with community. So if you can engage on the right issues with precision at the right time in the right place, first of all, you're demonstrating that you understand their worldview, their circumstance, and then you're starting at the right place. You're starting with the thing that is most material. And then what is magical in both of those domains, internal to a company and external
Yeah.
community, is where that conversation then goes to.
Yeah.
Practitioners are often really nervous about the internal conversation. And however, when I see GMs, when it's unlocked for them, then they are professional problem solvers with
Yes.
resources. And so they get around it and they will back you. They just need a credible plan for action.
Yes.
And then external, what you see is that it's a jumping off point for community to explore all sorts of things. Once you've demonstrated that credibility, to jump into all sorts of things that we're not measuring, but that are actually really important and relevant. And that then feeds back into the process. And you have this beautiful uplift of we're listening, we're engaging, we're shaping the way that we're listening to reflect your issues. And over time, the process itself is a relationship intervention.
Yes.
And a new type of conversation to have with community in a way that protects them in the conversation in places where that power dynamic is not equal.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think
And I love the longitudinal nature of this, Kieren, because having done a lot of social impact assessment work, the biggest challenge we have is we've got a limited finite, because the social impact is primarily, I mean, there are exceptions. Sometimes companies do it outside of the approvals process, but primarily social impact assessment happens as part of an approvals process. So it's time constrained, it's budget constrained. And we're going in trying to collect data at a point in time. But if there hasn't been the longitudinal community data, which is usually exactly what's missing, like getting census data in a country like Australia is one thing, but if you're in Indonesia or or even in Australian Indigenous people is still problematic. But it's, if you don't have the longitudinal data, measurement's really hard. So the best we can do is go, I've got if you're lucky, you've got an 18-month project. Sometimes it's 4 months or 6 months or 12 months. And you go, well, the best I can do is benchmark at the beginning and try and attempt to see if in that short period of time there's been any change or adjustments along that time. That's probably the best we're going to be able to achieve. Your work shifts that. So if we happen to be in a place where that approach is being used in the community and there is some longitudinal data that's been connected by a company or a council or whoever, then we're in a far better position as social impact practitioners to go, great, I don't have to guess, and start from scratch every time someone comes into this community or into this organization about what the relationship is. Because social impact assessment, what underpins that primarily is the trust and the relationship between the company. And I mean, there's lots of other things, of course, but if we want to fast track, and this is the biggest argument that happens, I think, is perception versus what an actual social impact is. And like I often say, if a perception can very rapidly become an actual impact in and of itself if you don't understand it and manage it. But the data that you've got with longitudinal would overcome a lot of those questions and feed into a lot of the understanding the difference between perception and what's actually happening in a community.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and I guess we came to that kind of accidentally again, which is what we were trying to do as researchers was to build a methodology that allowed us to observe the thing of interest, which is the relationship between companies and communities, and that relationship exists over time. So our methods should reflect the nature of the thing we're trying to observe. It should be longitudinal.
Mm.
And you're spot on that often the constraints placed on how we're asked to observe those things means that we miss a whole bunch of stuff. And you look at even census data, first of all, it doesn't doesn't look at how people are experiencing much of anything. It just looks at what they are, who they are, and where they are.
Yeah.
And it's every 6 years. So, that's a lot happens in between those two time points.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we really wanted to do was, once we kind of had done that early work, was to go, yeah, okay, well, the big piece that's missing here is that one shot doesn't really tell you how those things change over time. So if you try and do something differently, does it change how acceptable community members find what you're doing? As our modeling would suggest, it should. So actually, Anglo American took a punt on us and we did a 4-site project in South Africa and Australia, 3 in South Africa, 1 here, and I mean, it was very early days, and we were doing surveys with communities in 12 languages in South Africa using mobile phones, and it was amazing, actually,
Yeah.
given the 2 or 3 of us, and never done it before, and they took a real punt on us, and we did, I think, some really good work. There was the first version of what would then become local voices, and that showed us really clearly that there are where a company, where an asset took the data and did something meaningful with it, the data moved in the direction that the model told us it should,
Yeah.
and that reduced their risk and improved their relationship. And where an asset didn't do anything with the data, nothing changed in the data.
Yeah.
So immediately we're going, okay, well, we're trying to solve for that problem, develop longitudinal methodology, and yes, we can see that it can be useful in supporting different action that's focused on the things the community are telling you are most important to them. And these are often things that are outside of their awareness. So the statistical process is looking for associations between the way people respond to very different questions.
Yeah.
And the power of that is that we often do things that um, are outside of our awareness, that we're not aware that we're doing because of these things, and to be able to unpick that or reveal that was really useful. But then really important to do that within an ethical research framework, so that isn't misused, and community members are protected in that process. It's fundamental to credibility
Yeah.
for everybody. So I think that social impact assessment is exactly the right tool for the mechanism that it is applied to most often. But I do think, and we see it every day, that where a social impact assessment can incorporate this longitudinal understanding, then it is better. Regulators like it a lot because it helps them to see that this is already a company that takes its relationship seriously and
Yeah.
has a mechanism for community to be able to speak about those experiences over time. So a
Yeah.
mechanism for assessing how well you're going against your plan. And
Correct.
I think that speaks very strongly. We've seen that speed up applications for major expansions and whatnot.
Yeah. And like having been on the regulator side and as a practitioner, I mean, that resonates with me. I mean, it's hard if they haven't got anything, like the the product that you've been discussing. It's very hard to tell what they're doing. You're kind of relying on this qualitative data collected in a very short time frame. But if there's evidence that the company has been engaged with their community proactively over time, it makes the job of the social impact practitioner and the social impact report, and for the regulator to see that demonstrated. Because actions speak louder than words, right? I can write as many words. A report can have as many words as possible, but what you want to see within those words is that there are actions that are being taken on the part of the organisation to proactively engage with their community in a meaningful way uh,
Yeah.
around their
Well,
impact.
it's just a promise then otherwise, right?
Yeah,
It's a company promising to do things, and
yeah,
if you've got a record that you can stand on, then that has real weight. And it's just like every other thing we've been talking about. It's all the stuff around it that makes a difference in this. And so progressing an application is easier when you've set the conditions for trust that you will keep your promise, that you will do that.
yeah. And I think what's a really nice side of this, because I guess most of the conversation has been around, internally with companies and interacting with the companies around their social license. But social license, the other side of that is the community, right? And we talk about the community trust, but how, from your experience, being able to adopt this kind of approach in a community, how have you found that has been received by communities? What has been the impact for them? Like, what has been the shift and transition that you've seen happening in communities around being able to engage with such a bit more of a, I guess, a longitudinal tune and B, a more sophisticated tool that isn't just short term?
Yeah, I think we've got better at engaging communities over time, absolutely, and I think it's pretty well refined now. So we have great samples in some of the most remote locations on Earth. From jungles of Brazil and Ecuador to really remote places in Western Australia. We'll collect great data sets, and part of that, is communities seeing that speaking into the process has effect, that they're not speaking into a void. Big part of that is often companies and others will go and collect data and it goes into a black box and nobody ever sees it again. And that creates real sense of fatigue. And it's not survey fatigue, it's action fatigue. So an ethical research process should be upfront about who's paying for the work,
Yes.
what the work is for, how we're going to manage the data, and what are our obligations to you? What can you expect from us, and how do you address any concerns that you might have, as well as a few other things. That's first of all important. We make a promise to community that this is a safe way to speak about these experiences, and that's important. We also then have a rewards program. What we're trying to do is leverage individual effort completing a survey for a community level outcome. So the rewards are that every survey they complete, they assign tokens to one or more community-based organisations that we've vetted to make sure that they're not for profit. And then at the end of each process, each time we collect data, we add them all up, and those groups can invoice us for a real money donation. And so this is about us recognising that community-based organisations are the lifeblood of remote and regional Australia and every other country that we work in. And that might look a little different in each place, but fundamentally we're saying your voice matters,
Yeah.
and we understand that your time is valuable and that community-based organisations are important for how your community fits together and do great work. In terms of how the community then sort of take it, I think there's some great stories like in Ecuador, in fact, where we go out and we had a team in the field and they went around to all the villages and collected data, and then there were people that were upset that they hadn't been asked. We have a sampling framework and we collect the data we need and then we leave. But they were upset that they didn't get to participate. So I had to create a kind of WhatsApp link and put QR codes up in town squares. And so people could opt in to participate so they could have their voice heard as well. So these are people that have never been asked what they think before
Yeah.
about things that matter to them. And so I think where it works best, where communities take to it the strongest, is where they have a real stake in the relationship
Yeah.
and they really want to proactively shape what that relationship looks like. Where it struggles is where it's a bit kind of like, hey, just tell us what you think about this thing or company that doesn't really have any relationship to your day-to-day life.
Yeah.
And so ironically, I think often in regional areas, it's a bit more easy to do this work than it is in cities where there is a lot more noise, there's a lot more congestion and comms and marketing and all sorts of things. But our job is to kind of cut through that and understand what is it that's meaningful for community, and ensure that what we're delivering and what the companies are following through on is supporting community to see the value of participation.
Yeah, that's so true. I really love what you said about the fatigue as well. We hear about communications or, fatigue all the time.
Mm,
And I'm like you, I often go, well, I actually have never found that people don't want to talk about the things that really concern them. Like, to me, social impact, whether it be assessment or the research you're doing, it's personal. I think Ildiko in one of my earlier discussions talks about this, about how personal social impact work
mm,
actually is. It's personal for the communities. I quite often say I treat it as a privilege when they are willing to open up to me.
mm,
It is highly personal, and they're trusting somebody that they don't know with their story, and some of it's quite distressing for them, personal, sensitive. And I like the term you used. What was it again? It was action fatigue. Because I
action.
think you're right. That's what it actually is. It's not. They're not fatigued with people trying to address their problems. I mean, no one's going to get fatigued at someone trying to solve a problem for you. I think they do get fatigued, like you said, at telling people who, or being approached by people who really have no intention on actioning, or at least they perceive there's no, commitment to act on the information they're going to receive from this person. So it becomes a very one-way transaction. It's kind of, I'm going to take, and the reciprocity is not there, and so it kind of falls apart pretty quickly.
Exactly. I couldn't agree more. And we see that a lot in renewables right at the
Yeah.
moment, where a lot of community members are feeling like process is being weaponized to exhaust them and to make them sort of compliant and apathetic in the process, and that they're being asked to participate in predetermined processes. And whether they are or not, that's how it feels.
Yes.
And I think that part of that is how the industry is structured and all of that good stuff. But if the risk is that community opt out, or if they actively resist a development for only for the reason that the process is poor, then I think that's a disaster in the context of what we're trying to do with a renewable transition. The point of it.
Well, I think it's almost like it's almost creating the problem that doesn't need to be there.
Exactly. And I say, not to undermine opportunity for engagements in the future, but the attributes of good relationships, the attributes of productive process are well understood.
Mm.
So what we do in our work is to show which of those elements are most important in a particular place and point in time for particular groups of people.
Yes.
And often the solutions are quite straightforward, but they're all straightforward if they're applied correctly. It's often that incorrect solutions are correct solutions are applied inappropriately. And what works in one place won't work in another. So understanding what to do in a place is really useful. So actually what we get to there is it's an internal company issue quite often. And this is where we find in our work that our work really is. It's in helping companies to take action and to understand how they might need to change to achieve that effectively. And so it's one thing to understand the insights. It's another thing to do the useful thing with them.
Yes.
And more our work is focused on that part of the process, which is very natural. As you kind of solve problems along a kind of
Yeah.
pathway, you reveal the next, and that's
Yeah.
where we're at right now.
Yeah. And I think that's a really important point too, because I think there's a lot of the time of this protectionism, and I think that can come from the practitioner, the social practitioner. It can come from the company. It can even come from the community, where you kind of get this protective kind of thing, like you don't want to, you get in your own way and you get in the progress's way. But I think there's enough work around and enough problems around that when you solve one, you can guarantee there's going to be another problem to solve. It's guaranteed. And if you can stay focused on problem solving, then I think it kind of answers it removes a lot of any barriers that perceptions may have around it being a limiting exercise, because it's actually the opposite. It's an expansive exercise to solve problems, because it frees you up to see the next problem and the next problem. And yeah.
Yeah, I think about those problems as real challenges, like not in terms of sometimes what you see is community framed as the problem, where of
Yes.
course, what we're talking about here is a problem in our process, in our way of understanding, and approaching that with curiosity and real intent and determination to better reflect what the context requires from us to be effective, or to be good neighbours, or to adhere to the conditions of our approval, or whatever it might be, and to approach that really proactively and positively. I think that's the best part of the work, is to go, okay, that's interesting. We've seen that at 4 different locations now. That's our problem. That's not community's problem. How are we going to do things differently to get a different outcome?
Yeah, looking at the common denominator.
Yeah, it's not easy sometimes.
Yeah, look, self-reflection is the hardest thing to do. The easiest thing to do is to point at somebody else and point out their flaws. But looking at yourself in the mirror and seeing your own flaws is another thing altogether.
Oh, lucky we're perfect. Lucky we're perfect at that, Andrea.
Of course, Kieren, of course. But yeah, I really love that. But is there because I'm conscious of your time, and Thinking of the listeners, is there I guess, a project in particular that stands out to your mind that you'd like to share in terms of how you overcame the challenges and that you were really proud of, I guess? And it doesn't have to be with like anywhere along your career where you've just sort of gone like, that was just so rewarding.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's lots of great experiences. One that's pretty fresh, and who, a company, Lundin Mining, who gave me permission to share the story at a recent conference that I attended, is a great one where Candelaria, they have a large copper project in operation in Chile, northern Chile, so up in the desert, and there's a very close community, and then there is a larger kind of community center or town, a little ways off, and then there's a port facility where the concentrate is taken, and they had some real challenges there where, they had a big sinkhole open, to lay people off. The government shut them down. It's big project and it's complex. And we could see in their data that the ratings of trust within community and acceptance and things like procedural fairness were declining over time. The perceptions of impacts were increasing, and it was not good, and it was into quite dangerous territory, in terms of active opposition and community refusing to meet, and it was not good. So, however, also that local team, had really struggled to do some things with the data that are sort of, you know important early steps, like providing a summary of the data back to community is a closing the loop process that is really important.
Yeah.
An important part of an ethical research framework, but it's also just demonstrating respect and acknowledging that this is a co-created resource, that we did this
Yeah.
together. Here's us acknowledging that you have challenges with us, and we'd like to talk more about that. But that creates an enormous sense of vulnerability, and that's very normal. Where company people will say, but what will they do? It will create an expectation that we have to fix that thing. And actually, it's about creating an expectation that we're willing to talk about it and engage with each other on it. And sometimes there aren't solutions to some big problems, but there are other things that we can work on, and there are ways to demonstrate empathy in that context that will help. And so, we had worked with the site team for a really good group of people. And of course, we have the language challenge as well. And we're working with headquarters and with the site team. And over time, they were able to embrace that sense of vulnerability. They were able to share the results back with community, and then focus their engagement on parts of the community, on the specific things they were telling us were of real importance and were problematic for them. And then in doing that, what we saw was a turnaround in the data, and didn't just turn around, it flipped. And it was like community were just waiting for this moment to then embrace the relationship themselves. So often in conversation, we'll talk about, so you need to step forward. Vulnerability is about stepping forward into that space between you, hoping, trusting that they will step forward into that space with you. And that's what we saw with community play out just really amazingly. And so they went from being the poorest performing site in the group of 7 that we're working with Lundin, to being the best by far, and
Wow.
having the highest scores on those metrics of any of the sites that we work with around the world. Incredible and dramatic turnaround from doing quite simple things really
Yes.
well and really precisely, and effectively meeting community out there in that space, and embracing the conversation. And really incredible to see in data, and then to talk to that team in person online, and to see them kind of really proud of what they'd done, and
Sure.
really feeling much different and better about walking through those communities. It's a powerful thing. That's one I love, actually. That's quite recent.
That really speaks at the heart of why a lot of us do the kind of work we do. That's the kind of outcome that we're always looking for. That, and what was the time frame to turn that around? Just for the listeners there.
Yeah, so they've been declining for maybe 2 years, maybe a little longer, maybe 3, and then they turned it around in 18 months. So they
There you
went from very low to very high. And I think it's a really good point, actually. Often we hear people talk about trust, for example, being Mongolian at best, I think, which is it arrives on foot, and it
Yeah.
departs on horseback. So that's fantastic as a visual metaphor. But actually, the data shows that it's not quite right, or at least not right all the time. That trust is
Yeah.
quite dynamic. And so we tracked data through the Pilbara during the before and during and after the Jukan
Yeah.
Gorge incident. Trust never bottomed out there with local community. It dropped significantly and in a sustained way over time, but it never got to one on a 1 to 5 scale. And it built back once Rio Tinto demonstrated they were serious about change and that they
Yeah.
were embracing a different pathway. And regardless of any of the other detail there, their levels of trust now within those communities are the highest they've ever been. And and in big part that's because they're able to demonstrate that their response reflected who they wanted to be and they had ambitions to be different, and
Yes.
and their practice showed that, but it wasn't overnight. But trust can move quite dynamically depending
Yeah.
on how you engage on those issues that drive trust. So it's a nice
I love that story for multiple reasons. And one is because it just shows that you've dispelled a myth, which is about trust. People once you've broken trust, that's it. You hear those all those kind of definite kind of myths out there. But I think this just shows that you can turn it around a lot quicker than most people would anticipate. But not just that, I think it just shows that, you can actually shift trust. Like this belief that people have gone, oh, once you've broken trust, it's going to be near impossible. It's like, no. And it also maybe dispels it probably refocuses it on the fact that it really is about action. It's about showing that you're committed, that that's maybe what you should be looking for, and not whether or not what someone's saying or not saying at any given point in time, but kind of what actions they're taking. And that's on both sides, because I'm sure the community acted differently once they started to see that the company was acting differently. But I love that. I love it. And I love even more so that the data can demonstrate it and support that the trust actually shifted
Yeah,
in
it's a
such a
great reward. It's a great reward for practitioners, and
yeah,
it's a great signal to companies that the dramatic action that they took. People lost their jobs, and organization was restructured, and all sorts of things. That can lead to the outcome they're seeking, and has all sorts of benefits.
yeah.
So yeah, it's
That sounds like a case study you have to write up, Kieren, because that's a really good one, right?
well, I'm not like you. I find the time to write books and things, but yeah, I think it's definitely on the radar. Is how do we surface some of these experiences a little more quickly?
Yeah, yeah. So just to wrap this up and respect your time, if there's for listeners, then there's a lot of I know early career people. As you know, I start the series off at the beginning of the year with early career people. For people listening, people watching, who are wanting or people who are wanting to pursue a social impact career, what advice do you have for them?
Yeah, look, I'd say there is no one career as a starting point. That finding your way in is there are lots of ways to do that. I'd say definitely engage with some good structured training programs and courses in the area. There's some really good stuff out there now, which is great and shows that the profession is developing. I'd say it's
Definitely.
important to read. That there are some really great books coming out very soon at the time of recording. Um, uh, is one. Frank Van Clay's book and Maria's book is
Yes.
Estevez is is a classic and a cornerstone of the profession. And then I'd be trying to map who the good thinkers are in the space and try and find their stuff and read their stuff. So Richard Parsons, I mentioned earlier, is a former colleague of mine, done lots of really good stuff. But he writes stuff as well. He writes stuff on LinkedIn in response to things, and I think there's a lot of wisdom in kind of looking at how those people that you've mapped in the space, you know, engage with ideas, engage with the topics and the way that they think about stuff. That's kind of informal work, if you like, to understand the space better. And then I think it's absolutely vital to get your hands dirty. I don't think you can have a career in social impact assessment or or practice without working on the ground and having those experience. If for nothing else, then having credibility in other spaces. You need to understand what it looks like when somebody feels wronged, and you need to feel that discomfort, and you need to feel that inferred shame of being part of the, whether by directly or by extension, the machinery that created that thing. I think that is where empathy comes from, in experiencing those sorts of things. It makes you better,
Yes.
and less hard edged. And then get to the places where professionals in this space gather. Lots of informal kind of spaces, semi-formal spaces, so kind of people come together regularly and just to meet people. It's a very supportive network, I observe. And blag your way into conferences and stuff. Find somebody to fund you to go, your employer. Find a good business case, if you can, to get along. And I ran into somebody at a recent conference overseas who had kind of self-funded herself to go because she was so keen to ensure that she was up to date on her stuff. And that's
Yeah.
not an option available to everybody, of course, but I think it's a passionate area full of people who are willing to do what it takes to find their community, and it's a great community to find. So in there might be something that useful.
Yeah, no, I agree 100% with everything you said. No, I can vouch 100% for what you said. Like, an extremely supportive community, a wonderful bunch of people who love what they do and are just really good people. And I think finding your group and your community, I think, is really important.
Yeah.
And of course, the reading. Well, yeah, as a book writer, of course, I'm going to support that one. So, be kind of crazy not to. But you are the most effective social impact practitioner that's not a practitioner, Kieren. So it's been an absolute pleasure.
Put that in my bio. Yeah. I like that.
So wonderful. Thank you very much. And it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, Kieren, as
Oh,
always.
likewise. As always. Thanks, Andrea.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for watching. And if you're listening, thank you for listening. Remember to hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe. When you subscribe to the channel, I get more interesting guests and we can all learn, grow, and share our stories together. Thank you for listening. Remember, hit the like button, share, subscribe.